I'm going to call to order policy meeting for tonight. And hold on. We'll take attendance. Dr. Russell.
Here.
Mr. Saylor. I'm standing in for Mr. Saylor. Mr. Keenan.
Here.
Mrs. Evans-Brockett.
Here.
Ms. White.
Here.
Mr. Marsh.
Here.
Mr. Cleland.
Here.
Mr. Liggett.
Here.
Mr. Larson.
Here.
Mr. Cohen. Mrs. Lofton.
Here.
Mrs. Smith.
Here.
Mr. Moran.
Here.
Mr. Weaver.
Here.
And Dr. Boyd. Okay. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Okay, we will be taking comments from the audience. If you have any comments, please come to the microphone. Oh, okay.
Hi, I'll go first. My name's Denise Paniconi. I'm from Skip-Pack. And I brought 3 Bibles with me that I'd like to donate to the school library, if that's possible. Anyway, I'd like to address 2 things. I'll be pretty brief. So Liberty Champion is the official student newspaper of Liberty University, and in an article entitled "Most Americans Have a Misunderstanding of Separation of Church and State," it says that Christians should have courage to be bold in their faith. This means being a pillar of light in the spheres of influence that God has entrusted them with, and allow the truth of the Bible to guide their daily and political decision-making. The wall of separation is to keep the government from influencing our religious practice, not to keep our personal religious values separate from who we are, who we vote for, and what issues we stand for and against. I read a book. I read through it every year. It's called the Bible. In it, we learn that prophets of God were killed all throughout history because some people didn't like what they said. Even Jesus, the Messiah, the Holy One of God, was crucified for the same reason as well as most of his disciples. They were told to stop it. However, they answered their oppressors with this astounding answer: we must obey God rather than men. Beloved, believe not every spirit, but try the spirits, whether they are of God. If there be any book, philosophy, or person who presents something contrary to what the Bible says, it is a lie, plain and simple. And let me say something else. It's not mean or rude to tell people the truth, even if they don't like it. So therefore, it is unconstitutional to try to silence those we disagree with. To call names or attach adjectives is the very nature of bullying and is unacceptable in the public square. Which brings me to my second point. If any child, I don't care how they identify, whether they are of a religious persuasion or not, no matter what color their skin is, if any child is being bullied in school, and makes it known to this school board, something needs to be done about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Good evening. Melissa Overholser, Skipback Township. I am the parent of 2 PV graduates, and I am the Schwanksville Elementary librarian. To earn my master's in library science, I had to take 12 graduate library classes. I learned many things while taking those classes, such as how to use different technologies, how to collect and curate print and digital resources, how to make the library a 21st century space for learners, how to collect resources for children and young adults, library management, how to help students, teachers, and myself conduct research, how to catalog books, and how to use professional reviews when choosing books. But the most important thing I learned challenged me both personally and professionally. I learned that what happens within the walls of a library should be about the students who are using the space, and not about my personal beliefs or the trend in the world around the library. One of the most important things I see as part of my job is the choosing of books. I strive to put books in the library that extend the learning that is happening in the classrooms. I also strive to choose books that students will connect to personally and that will give students the opportunity to connect with others in their class, their school, their community, and their world. My passion as a librarian is to help students realize that there are books out there that they might not just enjoy reading. I strive to have books for those students who love to devour books, like my frequent flyers who come to see me almost every day to exchange their books. I love the challenge of a student telling me when they hate to read, like I did in school, and there are no books for them to read, to prove that there might just be a book for them to read on our shelves. I'm also okay with students choosing not to pick out a book because that might not be the right time for them or the right book for them then. My early childhood was a mess. I was lucky. In 7th grade, I finally got to live with my dad and stepmom in a stable home, which I'm thankful for every day. Because if I hadn't gotten out of my unstable home, I wouldn't have had a parent there to tell me about the craziness of the world. I might have had to rely on books that I got from the library to learn about life, both the good and the bad. To learn what a good or bad relationship looked like, or that there are people in the world that might take advantage of you sexually, or what it was like as a female to go through puberty. Or to learn how strong I was as a person, to see that I could overcome and change the path my life was taking. I sure wouldn't have had the money to be ordering books off Amazon, or buying them from a bookstore, or someone to take me to the library. Many students in our district are in that same boat. I've read and heard community members saying, why do we need the library, or how does that book connect to our curriculum? My answer would be, we strive to have our learners be readers, and that might be having enjoyable books for our students to read. Books provide a way for students to see the world around them. The 7 libraries in our district provide a way for all of our students in our district to read and have access to books. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. So we will move on. Number 2, policies review cycle. We have no policies for review this month. Number 3, policies, legal PSBA policy news. That doesn't apply for us right now. So we'll move on to number 4, local policies review. So tonight we'll start with policy 108 and 109, and I will turn it over to Dr. Russell and Mrs. Smith, and the goal is to make sure that we get through both this and also school police officers tonight. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Mares. So I'd like to give just a general overview to policies 108 and 109, explain the differences, and also some of the newer recommendations on the part of administration, and then hoping to facilitate discussion or conversation about where you may have questions as a committee or comments that you would like to share. So 108 really references curriculum materials, and we struck the term textbooks and substituted it for curriculum materials, and that was really the major change in the policy language itself. Because we're going to move into policy 109, and administration is aware of the questions on the part of some around some of the, in particular, sexually explicit content in our library books. And we'll talk about policy 109 and some of the proposed changes there. They're a little bit more involved than 108. But before we do that, I just want to mention that in our efforts really, to communicate and be transparent, connected to Policy 108, which really deals specifically with curriculum materials. Mrs. Folks and Mrs. Smith have prepared letters and plan to communicate with our community not only the curriculum documents and the anthology that might guide students, but also the novels that will be presented as part of whole group, so that the novels that all students would be expected to read are something that we will communicate with families as well. So again, when it comes to curriculum, the anthology or the standard textbook is a part of the curriculum. Typically, it's the core resource. In English, in our ELA courses, there are often whole group novels or novels that our students read. We will be communicating what those novels are. Mrs. Smith or Mrs. Folks, anything to add to that?
I mean, I'll just elaborate by sharing that we currently are going through curriculum review here at the high school for grades 9 and 10. So as Dr. Russell is referencing letters, that is what I would also be prepared to talk about at our education committee ad hoc, which I believe is next week. And then when we do move the curriculum documents forward. So I would see this as being something that we can continue to communicate in that effort of transparency as we move through curriculum revision.
So are there any questions on Policy 108 and what's been proposed before we move to 109? Okay. Is the committee okay to move that? I'm sorry,
So
Mrs. Lupton.
I
Yeah.
do have a question related to one of the, I believe it's one of the admin regs. And it is, hold on, let me see if I can find the one I was looking for. It is 108AR3, I believe. Let me see if I can. No, I'm sorry, that is not the one that, hold on. 108AR5. So, my question is on page 2, about 2/3 of the way down the page. And so as a part, a little bit further down. So does the material contain sexual contents? And that phrase is replacing, is there a preoccupation with sex, violence, cruelty, or brutality? And so I don't necessarily have a problem with it saying, does the material contain sexual content that would make it inappropriate for children or young adults? But I'm not sure why we are no longer concerned about any mention of violence. I would think that we would be, there's a lot of very violent, gory material in books that wouldn't necessarily be appropriate for the youngest of readers, that could be more appropriate at a later age. So I'm not sure why we're only focusing on sexual content.
I think that's a great question.
I was just going to add that I think that we were just trying to keep some of the language consistent with 109. We could certainly add that back into it. I think these are also curricular materials, and typically there's not necessarily brutality in a math textbook or in a science textbook. But however, there certainly could be, so we could keep it in.
Well, I think it's more as you look into social studies and learning about history oftentimes involves a lot of brutality, and the way that gets presented in elementary school wouldn't necessarily be, or the way you would want to present that in high school and make people aware of the actual history that happened is not necessarily something that's going to be appropriate for readers at an elementary level or learners at an elementary level. So that's, again, I think violence, cruelty, brutality, there's a whole range of, just as far as talking about bullying, the way you, like, if you were reading a book about how to deal with a bully, that's going to be different at a high school level than it is going to be at an elementary level. So again, I just think the focus on sexual content doesn't look at everything that goes into childhood development. And young adult development. And so really the question should be, do you feel this content, there's material in this book that makes it inappropriate? Because it really could be anything. It could be drug use, it could be alcohol abuse, it could be suicide. I wouldn't want to sit down with a book of kindergartners or sit down with a group of kindergartners, read them a book about suicide. So again, there's just whether or not something's age appropriate. I don't know why our only issue here is around sex.
Administration is happy to consider putting that statement back in and even considering is the content that makes this
Just a broad statement of, is
Inappropriate.
this, yeah.
age inappropriate. It would raise questions and be indicated there. Okay. Anything else about 108 and any of the ARs there?
Yeah, I do. Same page as you, in the same line, but just two sections or just two lines down from there. Young adults, I think we should define young adults, and no disrespect whatsoever to the high school students, but legally they're not adults unless they're 18. And there are 18-year-olds and above in high school. So I think it should just demark somehow children and high school students. And or we put an age range, right? 13 to 21 or whatever the final age is, instead of young adults. My son's at Florida State. He's almost graduating. He's 19 years old. He's a young adult. I still have to talk to him all the time about what he should be or not be doing because they're still very impulsive. So that's why I think we should define young adults.
If I could make a suggestion, I wonder if we could maybe rephrase that to be more, this is for if there's a reevaluation request of a curricular material. Maybe it's, is their content not appropriate for the group of students that this is going to be used for? Like, for example, if it's an elementary book, we know we're talking about maybe third graders or fourth graders. If it's a high school, that way we may not have to define actually young adult, but say, is it appropriate for the group of students that are using it? If the group is okay with that.
And to follow to that, first I was thinking, yep, maybe we say elementary, middle, or high, but what's appropriate for a fifth grader isn't going to be appropriate for a kindergartner, just like what's appropriate for an 18-year-old at the high school, and I think there are many of them, might not be appropriate for a 14-year-old. And so there's a range across of maturity levels and educational readiness for different materials across each building. So, yeah.
Okay, very helpful. Others? Any other comments? ARs associated with 108? Okay. Okay. All right. So we'll move on to 109, and let's see if I have that open here. So one of the things that we did initially was to actually change the title to be specific to library materials. And we have, again, as Mrs. Smith just mentioned, attempted to bring some consistency to the language we're using. Instead of disposal, we're referencing weeded. We incorporated an additional definition there, library materials. That came from some of the other policies that we were referencing and reviewing, 109.1 and .2. And then when it comes to selection guidelines, we wanted to emphasize the fact that when we are selecting books or when a committee reviews them, it is the book in its entirety. It is taken as a whole when considered whether or not it's appropriate. We've also suggested that we consult a variety of published reviews. One of the challenges that we've discussed is that sometimes the descriptions aren't comprehensive. And so when librarians would order some of these books, they really weren't aware of some of what was in. We want to be aware and make informed recommendations for the books. So that statement references we want to look at a variety of published reviews. We've also incorporated the parental considerations piece, as well as how we optimize the library resources, and we've included a definition about sexual content. So this is something that I really want to introduce to the committee and get some comments around. What I learned was, and let me back up, initially some of the major questions or concerns were really around sexually explicit content, or content that some viewed in that way. And when our committees were reviewing the books, they wanted something that would ground them in really identifying or defining sexually explicit or obscene. The Miller test emerged out of a Supreme Court decision in the early 70s, and it was a test that some of our committees went to as they were trying to assess and evaluate some of the content that had raised questions. So it's been incorporated here. We may or may not want to keep it in the policy. We may want to instead incorporate it or leave it in the admin reg. But we've incorporated it because of some conversations with our staff that used it, and it allowed them to sort of ground themselves in a definition with a test that's out of the Supreme Court case. Then we talk about the reevaluation procedures. One of the things I want to emphasize is we would like to prevent and avoid anyone from opting out of an informal hearing as a step in this process to reevaluate a book when it's submitted. And then also, again, in our efforts to be transparent and communicate with individuals, some of the questions that have been raised to us, we will continue to communicate these books that have been raised with questions. And parents via AR7 can opt their children out of signing out any of these books, whether they're the ones that have been reevaluated or they are other ones that they have some questions or concerns around. So again, that's that accommodation that we've been talking about in our efforts to appeal to parents who have questions or are struggling with some of the content in these books. All right.
Dr. Russell,
Yes.
comment at this point?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that overview. That was helpful, and how we got to this point. I want to start by saying that I'm going to summarize and say that I'm not in favor of the Miller test for how we look at the books, and I'm open to having somebody, convince me otherwise. I'm definitely open to that. So I want to hear from my peers on this, but from my perspective, the Miller test, as you mentioned, came out of a Supreme Court case in the 70s. It's effectively an obscenity test, and it contains 3 parts, and all 3 parts have to be met in order to find that the material is obscene. So, in effect, what that means is that, for all intents and purposes, the test is flawed, because on the one hand, it could lead to censorship, but when you apply the test criteria, it's effectively going to hold that it's very difficult to find anything obscene, because books by definition are literary, so they have literary value, right? They have artistic value. So when you apply those 3 criteria to any material, just because it has sexual content, it will never rise to the bar of meeting the obscenity test of the Miller test. So the Miller test is really flawed for this purpose, in my opinion. So I think just flat out, I don't know how to support it in this context, and I would like my peers to comment before they do. What I would offer is that maybe there's a subsequent test that came out of the 1982 PICO ruling, right? So the PICO ruling, Supreme Court, was specifically to the school board that pulled materials. And in PICO in 1982, what they found is that effectively schools may remove library books if they are pervasively vulgar or aren't age appropriate or educationally suitable. Schools may not try to instill orthodoxy in how students think about a given topic. So generally, schools should apply the First Amendment, and they should not remove books from school library shelves simply because they dislike the ideas contained in those books. But again, it held that the schools may pull books and have the leeway to go around the First Amendment for books that are not age appropriate or educationally appropriate. I think that's a way better test than the Miller test. I think the Miller test is going to find that every book is okay, and it's not going to be useful to us whatsoever. What's the purpose of using the Miller test? So that's my perspective on it, and I definitely would love to hear other people's comments about this.
So one of the questions, oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Cohen. I'm sorry.
I would tend to agree on the Miller test. I think that there's a lot of disparities that have been reported. I think that there's room in there that have been reported by the court that different localities or communities can act differently. And basically, you could have a situation where one part of our community is looking at something in one way and another part is looking at it in a different way. So I think that there is a different way we need to look at this. In looking at what has occurred over the last couple of months with all the conversations, I think we're talking about age-appropriate material. And age-appropriate material is different for elementary, it's different for middle, and it's different for high school. And we can't have a test that would allow something that would be in the high school would also have to be in the elementary school. We have to look at each one and have criteria for each one separately. If we take a look at the original proposal, there was demarcations for what should be in each one of the schools and tests for it. I'm not suggesting that those are exactly what we should follow, but they came up with a starting point of saying in our elementary school, here's what we say are age-appropriate material, here's what we say for middle school, here's what we say for high school. The problem is there's been too many interpretations by different people. We need hard, fast rules that say this is what's appropriate and this is what's not appropriate. And if material falls that is inappropriate, keep it in the library, keep it in the schools. But parents need to opt in, not opt out. The average parent is not going to be able to start filling out forms saying this book, this publication, I don't want my child to have. If there are things that fall over the line as we define it as a team, then let parents who say it's okay for my kids, let them opt in for it and let them have it. But don't turn it in the other direction. You're putting an undue burden on the majority of parents.
Just looking, a couple things, trying to connect a few thoughts here. The Miller test should emphasize how the average person would see the material taken as a whole. And it does connect to state law. So it defines that through state law, which brings it more local. So to me, just thinking logically about this, it would maybe make some sense with those definitions that we talked about with age appropriate or level or however we want to describe them, that if this is indeed one that is used, that you've now connected a Supreme Court ruling to our policy that you can use those levels to decipher through this test, and you're not violating anything in the law as I see it logically. So it could be a vehicle to connect federal law to state to our policy as a way to filter some of this. It doesn't address the concerns that have been shared here, but it's just a feature I'm sharing.
So I have a question specifically about the Miller test, and and I'm not familiar with the court case that this emerged from, but as I'm looking at this for a definition of obscene, I'm thinking this applies to content that would be read by adults. Is that correct? I mean, and so getting back to the point that was raised earlier, again, what's appropriate at a high school level, whether you're talking about sexual content or violence content, isn't going to be necessarily appropriate at an elementary level. And so if we feel that we need to have a definition about whether or not something is obscene, then looking to this judgment makes sense. But we're not getting at what's appropriate at each grade level for this. And so I go back to what I said at our meeting last month, is that I think that the best way to decide what's most appropriate at the age level is to have our educators, who are our experts in childhood development and have been working with students and are very close to knowing what their educational and abilities and skills and interests are, and their developmental needs are at each age, be the individuals who can select the materials for and review the materials for our classroom. Because even within this, I mean, I don't know, we're still saying we're applying contemporary community standards. What's a contemporary community standard? How is that defined? You know, and the concern I had about last month's, the policy that was brought up before as 109.1, is that you're talking about explicit sexual content. You're also talking about implied sexual content. And the vagueness of implied sexual content, I don't know how that could possibly be an objective criteria could be developed to determine whether or not something sexual is implied, because so much of that communication depends on the perspective of the person receiving the communication. So literature is art. You can't have it's got the color red in it, therefore we can't have it. You know, there's, what if it's pink? What if it's there's all these gradations. And so there's no way to really say, I'm going to draw my line here, and this is okay. And objectively, I really like the idea of saying, oh, you know what, this is something you might want to take a closer look at to decide if it's right for your child. But then how do you even decide where you draw that line? If we can't come up with a definition of what implied sexual content is, then how are we going to say these are the, or just to my point earlier around violence? This was a really graphic description of how prisoners of war were tortured. I don't think that's appropriate. That might be traumatizing to my child to read. I don't think that that's appropriate for my child. And it doesn't have to be something sexual. There's each resource is going to be unique, and so there's 1,000 different shades of gray in how you could interpret it, and so there's no one way to draw a line and say these are the ones that everybody can agree on, and these are the ones that only a subset of people are going to agree on. And so where you draw that line becomes impossible.
I want to make a clarifying remark on the Miller test. I like how, Mr. Marsh, how you tied that back on the test of the community aspect of it. However, I still think the Miller test would be flawed in our context, and the reason is because it requires that all three elements are met to find that the material is inappropriate or obscene. So one of those criteria that have to be met is that the material is found to lack literary value. We're not going to find any material that lacks literary material in most instances. So we're not going to be able to find that any material is really not going to be obscene in that definition of the Miller test, in my opinion. In terms of it talking about age, the Miller test was applied to a case where somebody was actually selling pornographic materials and the community didn't want them to. It found that they had a right to do so. But it doesn't talk to age. Instead, it talks to the community, and then it says what the average person would find obscene. So the average person and not the most sensitive person in the room. But again, I think when you apply all three criteria, you're not going to find anything that's really obscene. And that's why I think we have to go to PICO, which was a 1982 Supreme Court case that specifically dealt with taking books out of a school library, and they found that the Supreme Court, and this was an opinion written by Justice Brennan, who was a liberal Supreme Court justice, and he found that schools do have the latitude to remove materials that are not age appropriate or that lack educational value. So the schools have that leeway, recognizing that you have to make decisions for your school on what's going to be in the library, and they're not going to have everything. A school would have that leeway, and I think the PICO test applies better in our circumstance.
So I have a question. Am I correct in hearing, I'm hearing maybe some agreement here that we can, and correct me if I'm wrong, that this school administration, we can ask them to look at and recommend age-appropriate materials, as they're already starting to do with the letters, right, that you're sending. The two things, you would have age-appropriate categories or materials, you're going to look at that, and also inform parents, which it sounds like you're starting to do with books that are going to be in the curriculum that might have some concerning topics.
What
No.
letters are being sent?
So from the administration, they have,
I can speak to that, Mrs. Maris,
Thank
if you'd
you.
like. So as part of our curriculum review, just something that we had intended to do is, as we've been doing new English language arts curriculum, Mrs. Folks has been leading our teachers to really have more conversations about what's occurring in our classrooms beyond, let's say, the textbook that we have. There are times where we have whole reads, whole novel book reads, and we thought it would be very appropriate to be transparent and include in the actual curriculum document. So when we bring those to the board in May and in June, you will see an appendix in, for example, the elementary ones that are going to list these are potential whole group reads, so that as a parent, if you look at the curriculum, you can see, oh, they're reading Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory in whatever grade that may be. We also, in addition, created letters that the teacher can send out at the beginning of their English language arts course, for example, at the high school, to say, these are potential titles that we will be reading. It doesn't mean that these titles might have inappropriate material in them. It just means that these are books that all students in 9th grade will read. It does not indicate that there is any inappropriate content in the books. They're just whole group read, so that you as a parent are aware, my child's going to read this book. Maybe I want to read it, or I want to talk to them about it, or maybe I want to investigate it, and maybe I am concerned about something in the book.
So what if one of the books is part of the
Well, I mean, I think that's why, as part of the ARs for Policy 108, there is a reconsideration. I mean, if a parent wants to challenge something, but I think it would work the same way that it always has, maybe not in such a public forum, but I mean, there could be an alternative title proposed for a particular child.
I kind of have a thought on that. I agree that the Miller test can have its flaws, and perhaps the PICO test may be more suited. Either way, this is part of the selection guidelines as I'm reading it. And while these are good additions to that, sometimes we forget about what's already in the policies here, namely in Section 1 of this, that the materials shall be suited to the varied interest, abilities, and reading levels and maturation levels of the students to be served. In the selection of, in this case, it would be library materials, that's the number one concern here, is that we already are talking about the maturation levels. If we get into the hot button topic of when the material is asked to be reevaluated, whether it's the Miller test or the PICO test, both of them fall under maturation levels of the school and of the building there. So while I think it's nice that we want to add in things that we think are appropriate or not, in this case we're only calling out sexual content. Whatever tests that we use to do that, but as the points were made earlier about suicide, violence, and all the other things that can make a book age inappropriate, we're not calling them out here. And I don't think that a laundry list of all the things that are unacceptable is the way to go. This is a selection process that's being used by our administration. And I believe that they have the maturity level to understand what maturity levels are for the buildings that they're in. So I understand that we want to talk about a lot of the details, the Miller tests and all this, but I think if we go back to the general theory of policies is that we want to give the administration guidelines where we want them to go, but it's not supposed to be so specific that they lose the freedom to make choices. And when they do make a choice that's inappropriate, that's why we do have the reevaluation methods so that we can test that. The other point I want to go is there's a lot of talk about this opt-in stuff. And in this section in 109, we're talking about the library. Opting in, I think, puts a burden not on the people that are wanting to protect their children or they have a specific cause, but it spreads the burden throughout the entire community. I can't imagine having to go through and say, Hungry Caterpillar, I want to make sure that I opt in on that. It puts a reverse burden on the community as a whole. And that's why I'm very much in favor of what Dr. Russell's proposed with the opt-out program. Do I see the problem with the opt-out in that a parent has to know what it is? I do see that. I see that's an issue, and I'm hoping that at some point we'll be smart enough to figure out what would be a way that we could better guide people or allow parents to find out what this material is that they want to make sure that they protect their children from. I think at this point in the process, though, between the reevaluations that are in place and an opt-out method, I think that we can address most of the concerns of the community and the administration and the educators that are here.
And wouldn't that fall along the lines of trusting our administration and teachers to
I wanted to, if I may, go back to Mr. Cohen. You made a comment about age appropriate or inappropriate, and I think our conversations have shifted over time where for a while we were very focused on sexually explicit or pornography in our books and concerned about that. We're shifting now to age appropriate. I want to make sure the guidelines are set up to help us to actually, we should review that and make sure that that's clear enough for us in what's articulated. The other comment that I wanted to offer is really around the opt-in, and I appreciate the suggestion. You mentioned that if books are inappropriate, then parents could simply opt in. If a book is deemed inappropriate, having gone through the reevaluation process, it will be removed from the library, so it wouldn't exist in our library. So what could happen, though, if we do decide to go to an opt-in, is any reevaluated book, instead of offering parents the opportunity to opt out, any reevaluated book that is successful through the process to remain in our library would be stored in a special space. And then students would have to bring consent or a note, if I'm following it right, to opt in and be able to sign that book out.
Wait, can you stop? I just want to make sure I understood that right. What you're saying is if we evaluate a book and the book remains, that we're effectively rating the book?
Well, what I'm saying is if we go with an opt-in option.
Only in an opt-in.
Right, opt-in. If we go with an opt-in, my question for the group is, these books that come out of a reevaluation process and are successful through the process, because if they're not successful, they're not going to stay in the library. But if they're successful and we want to move to an opt-in, then they have to be somewhere in the library where the librarian has to be able to get a note or consent from a parent that says, my child can sign this book out. Now, my question is, hold on, my question is, if we move that way, I'm concerned about, first of all, a student having to approach the librarian to share that consent, and that being an uncomfortable position for the student. I'm also concerned if reevaluated books, and let's say I'm a parent and I challenge 20 books that make it through the reevaluation process, but parents have to opt their children in, then we have people in the community making decisions for us about which books our kids can sign out. And I don't know that we want that. I'm not recommending that, but we need to think about that as part of the opt-in process.
I was just going to say, I don't think that that's, I mean, we've seen the news where, there are some school districts that are overwhelmed with the number of reevaluation requests. We could get into a situation where half of our library has to be behind closed doors or something. And because there is no, when a parent or a community member submits a reevaluation request, there's no requirement that they have to have read the book or provide specific examples or that kind of thing. I think that could cause a real problem.
To that point, Mrs. Evans-Brockett, we are recommending that people do read the book in full. That wasn't a revision to the AR. That was how it was approached before. Are we
Recommending.
It says recommended because we can't assess whether they have read it or not. So it is a recommendation. We highly encourage it, but we can't assess whether somebody has. Correct.
So to your point.
Right, and a lot of these, there is a list of challenge books going around where the challenges are already written out for people. So I think we're getting into a slippery slope if we start locking books behind a door.
Go ahead.
So how about the manpower in order to accomplish these? Please use your microphone because we would like to hear you. We can't hear you at all. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so distracted by like this grumble like lower level grumble back here with the commentary. So I apologize that you can't hear me. Generally, I'm pretty loud. So my question is, at what point do we assess the manpower associated with these challenges? And how will that be handled to Mrs. Evans-Brockett's point, to a larger scale potentially, if we're just having, residents who are taxpayers but don't necessarily have a stake in student education in our buildings, submitting a cycle of requests.
I have to admit that's part of the reason that I like the nomenclature that was previous in the ARs, calling it a challenger rather than the reevaluator, because at that point when they're doing that, they are challenging the book. I think it's an appropriate adjective for what's going on. They're challenging the book. The material at that point is challenge materials. And I think anything else is just, we're just playing around with words. I would prefer to use the word that means exactly what it is, and it's a challenged book. This person is challenging this being in our library. I think that's plain, simple English. I don't think it's derogatory. It's the same thing as when two boxers meet. There's a champion and a challenger. I don't think there's a negative connotation to it, but I think it describes accurately what that person is doing.
Well, Mr. Liggett, I wanted to go back to your earlier point. I think you made a couple of good points earlier, but just on that last note, I hope it doesn't come to two boxers are duking it out to decide whether the book is going to stay or not.
Agreed. Yeah, it's not. It's not that, but you do it.
I like that.
You would admit though, it is a challenge. They're saying there's something that is before them, and they're saying,
Yeah.
I don't want this.
I'm not personally. I'm not held up on the challenge versus evaluate or reevaluate or reassessment nomenclature. But to your earlier point, though, I feel like we were maybe we were in alignment in terms of you made the point that number 1 in 109 talks to the maturation level, and I agree with I think what you said, that we can't really enumerate every type of vulgar or dangerous content. We just can't do that. So, a lot of this is outlined here. And I think where you were going then is you essentially agree that it's about age-appropriate materials. If it's about maturation level, it's age-appropriate.
Correct.
And I think you agree then the Miller test serves no purpose. The Miller test doesn't get us to any of that. The Miller test is not an age-appropriate test. It will not test for age appropriateness.
Oh, I agree with that because it's a community standard test. It is not. It has absolutely. It doesn't speak to age appropriateness at all. To use the Miller test, we would need to add an additional layer of what would be age appropriate, and then we're putting in another set of definitions.
Yeah, I almost feel that.
I'm with you on that. Totally, Russ. I mean, I would take that. I would have no problem striking that entire paragraph.
So then, I think Dr. Russell, then you asked, like, if we're talking about age appropriate, then we are getting back into maybe subjective area. And so, can the group talk about either, two things I was going to suggest is, how do we define age appropriate? Do we all come together and say, that you categorize it based on that it has visual depictions of sexual content with, suggested sexual behaviors, or that it actually shows sexual behaviors, and that constitutes age inappropriate material? But then would that be at what age levels, right? Because I do think we have to have different levels based on maturation. So I'd agree. So do we try to define what age appropriate is at the different ages?
Well,
Or do
wouldn't that
we
be
go
the-
to a rating system where, as you are looking at the books, you said there would be challenges or reevaluations. If you do that, you now can rate that book. It's surviving, it's staying in the library perhaps, but now you know if it's X. And you just say that. And so now if I want to opt out, or as Mr. Cohen said, he wants an opt-in process. But either way, if I want to opt out, I could say, don't allow my child to have this book and also anything you've rated X. I'm not suggesting we go back to every book in the library and rate them all. We've all talked about that in previous meetings. I don't think that's tenable, but I think that rating books that are being challenged seems that it wouldn't be an undue burden to the staff, to Mrs. White's point. And then, and/or any new books that come in. I heard, I think, a figure of 200 new books come in a year. Some of those are going to be cookbooks. Some of those are going to be books on baseball. Most of those are going to fly through the review process. But if 15 or 20 of them have to be looked at from cover to cover, is that really an undue burden to rate books? I'm not saying that all students should not have access to those books, but I think the community would like ratings on books.
I don't disagree with you about that the community need. Oh, I'm sorry.
I'd just like to comment on a few things that have been mentioned. I really do appreciate that the selection guidelines were brought up in the policy, because I think that there is some, definitive language there that is already, and has been for years looked at, that will continue to be looked at. And I think that that should really, again, be emphasized. I realize that perhaps we're going to end up with some language around sexual content or sexual explicit. I will tell you, though, that I'm very concerned that we're going to have an illusion of something being specific that's really not, particularly for young adult books. So I am very concerned about that, wherever the language may land. And I do want to recognize, as we heard even in our public comments, that we have librarians who are professionally trained and who have taken courses on book selection and who think about things such as grade levels, student interest, et cetera, et cetera. I also want to talk about the man hours that were brought up, because this policy has taken up an incredible amount of time, both administratively as well as for our librarian staff as well, who have teaching responsibilities in addition to what they do in terms of curating our collections. on that note, then, it's not 200 books. It might be 200 books in one order. We have 7 libraries. We have multiple orders throughout a year. I can also speak and say that I want to see that any policy that is created is something that is feasible, both as the supervisor of library, who would be asked to facilitate this process and make sure that it is something we are actually not only just putting on paper, but we can actually do, as well as something that's feasible for our librarians as well. So I can speak and say that the idea of a rating system where one does not exist because one does not exist in terms of the published reviews that we're looking at, that would not be something that in any way could be feasible, or that our library staff or myself would be comfortable doing. And I'd be happy to elaborate more on what our librarians do or some of the other concerns if there are specific questions to anything just shared.
So I have a comment, two, really. First, under reevaluation procedures, can't we just have it be that parent and guardians of the district that have students in the schools are the ones who could formally submit a complaint? Why do we have, or any district resident? That's my first question.
Because they pay taxes. They have every right, just like in speaking in public comment. Their tax money goes towards that. They're part of the community that, let's say,
Their students
establishes
not being
standards.
impacted, so.
I understand that, but you start to go down that road, then are we going to ask during public commentary for people to produce an ID and prove that they have a
No,
student?
I'm asking for this.
I get it, but
so
I think it's a
you're
slippery.
saying-
It's a very
what
slippery
you're
slope
saying.
if you were to restrict it to that. If we were to do that, then some of the previous challenges that were made, we're going to have to make sure that the child actually is in that building that a challenge is being made. Again, I think it's a slippery slope. I would think I would be more in favor of how it is right now. Any citizen of the district can make that challenge. That's, I think, the fairest way to do this in a public school.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead. I do tend to agree with Mr. Liggett on that point that this is the community and anybody can have a say. I do wonder why we switched it so that anyone can challenge materials anonymously, because I think that has the potential to open up the floodgates for a large number of requests to come in. And hearing Mrs. Folks share her concern about how this is already impacting the department and is stretching the department very thin, I do worry about why it was recently switched to become anonymous.
I think that's an important question, and I am aware that question was raised and a part of some social media conversations. I'm not a member of these pages, but I was informed of some questions that came up around that particular issue. And initially, and again, this is sort of new territory for us, we're tweaking the process as we go along. Initially, there was nothing anonymous, the individuals on the committee or the individual who had requested the complaint. And then over time, there were questions about individuals serving on these committees and the request that they remain anonymous, and administration honored that. And in response to that, also offered then that to the committee, the complainant is anonymous. A right to know request does provide that information if somebody's interested, but it really was in an effort to be fair and try and eliminate bias in the system. So individuals on the committee are anonymous to the complainant. The complainant, him or herself, is anonymous to the committee members, except
So
the
that
principal.
makes sense to me. It's sort of like a peer review process when you send in a research paper, no one knows, but then when the paper ultimately is published, your name is on it. Right. So, but the way I read the AR, it said the complainant's name will remain confidential.
It should, we can clarify that,
Okay.
Mrs. Lofton. It should be through the process to the committee. That's the intent. and we can go back and look at that language and make sure it represents. That's the intent of administration right now.
Dr. Russell, in addition to that, wouldn't the confidentiality of that come if we do publish, like it says in the last part of this, of the proposed policy, if you're going to put on the website the list of books that are challenged there, I would think there should be a measure of confidentiality at that point where we're essentially not outing the citizen that made that request.
That is the path that administration has taken to date. That's correct. Unless a right to know request has been submitted to me, that the complainant has remained confidential.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wait, can I ask one last question on that last paragraph with the publishing on the website? Would that be for informal and formal challenges or only a formal, formal reevaluation? I like the word challenge. It doesn't call it out specifically.
Right. We were thinking, I think the intent is formal process because it's gone through the entire process. But as you bring that up, it's certainly prompting my thinking, and maybe we need to look at that and clarify in the language.
Okay,
Can
thank
I
you.
make a request to the chair? Can we set a time limit on these first two policies? Because I think that we're going to need to bring these back to policy committee again. And I think it's important we move on to the SPOs because we need to establish that in order to be able to hire.
Yep, I agree. I was shooting for 7, now we're trying for 7:15. So, thank you. Yep.
May I just briefly put a few thoughts out there, because we'll go all over the place and might not get anywhere near any of these, but I've mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, before really any of the books came up, that I was a fan of Title 18, Section 5903. We're Pennsylvanians, and that whole obscenity test, again, it doesn't apply to minors. It has nothing to do with age appropriateness. And we're Pennsylvanians, and we have agreed, and we have passed a law that protects our minors from lewd, lascivious materials, and protects them from businesses such as ourselves pushing them and presenting them to children. And there are regulations, and there is a description of what they are, and they do relate back to, here we are, Ryan Marsh, way back at the beginning, relating this to some sort of community standard, but related to age appropriateness as well. And Pennsylvania has already done that. It's there. Now, there are exceptions for all libraries, and they did include public school libraries for that, but I think, well, I'll just share what I'd like to see. I'd like to see that be our guiding principle in evaluating books based on whether they are harmful to minors as is established by the law in Pennsylvania. And there are, may I note for everybody too, one thing that we didn't get into, and we don't need to get into it in great detail tonight, is that there is a difference between an evaluation of the written word and an evaluation of depictions, images, videos, things of that nature, even audio. And there are different ways of evaluating that. I mean, seeing nudity in people being nude in a sexual position is a bit more extreme than a word by word description of maybe a physical position, maybe in biology, maybe a discussion of again the acts in a way that is not meant to excite. But when you see two young individuals who are appealing to these people, the mirror of it, but they're attracted to it because it's meant to make them hot. That is probably not appropriate on a different level. So anyway, there are different standards in that section 5903 for images as opposed to evaluating books, but it all relates back again to age appropriateness. And I'm not going to say ever that we'll all agree, but people have thought about this long and hard. How do they analyze this? And for most of the people in the room, I'm overanalyzing it because, you don't want to look at these things in close detail. But the section goes into, let me see, where is it? A description of the restrictions. So on, where is it? Minors, that describes, let's see, where is it? Dissemination to a minor. So it talks about being harmful to a minor. Sorry. And there we go. So harmful to a minor includes, sorry, a bunch of different things. But it talks about just some of the things that came up here too, and one of the issues was violence. It talks about sexual activity as well as sadomasochistic abuse. So the violence is covered, and that being, you know, your issue, that would be something that is already written into the law here in Pennsylvania. Now it's defined, harmful to minors means that quality of any description or representation in whatever form of nudity, sexual conduct, sexual excitement, or sadomasochistic abuse when it predominantly appeals to the prurient, shameful, or morbid interest of minors and is patently, so there's the age appropriate, is patently offensive to prevailing standards in the adult community as a whole with respect to what is suitable material for minors. Anyway, some of you don't get what I'm saying, but what it goes to is this, and what all this goes to is this. All Boys Aren't Blue is in the library here, and that's 18 plus material. So whoever let that in here put pornographic material in our library, and they might not have known it, but nobody's pulled it off the shelves. And I can't say for the world of me why. So that book would be illegal anywhere else in the state, anywhere except for a library. That book would be illegal. People, you would be arrested if you walked up to a minor and handed that to him. If you walked up to a 17-year-old, you would be arrested outside of this room. All right? But they get to do it in here because they want to push this material on minors. And we never thought that that would happen. Here's what's happening. It's happening right now. And it wasn't happening. All right? 2 years ago, I looked for these books in this library. They weren't here. All right? All of these challenged books have come in the last 2 years. The last 2 years. We didn't need a policy against sexually explicit materials 2 years ago. Just 2 years ago. And now we do. Why? Because they're bringing them in, and they won't stop. So stop bringing them in if you don't want this to be an issue. Now, I do have one question. Just get that out of the way. I don't want to run too far over, and we have plenty of time to talk about this. You know, I'm here for 2 more years. So when I do want to ask, were the librarians ever directed in any way to remove any Dr. Seuss books from the shelves of the libraries, whether it be elementary, middle, or high school? I'm curious. I don't know. I've heard that they were. I'm wondering if they were ever directed to remove Dr. Seuss books.
Not to my knowledge, Mr. Keenan, no.
Well, I'm not sure. Not that you wouldn't know, but somebody else might have better information.
I can't tell you that they were directed to remove them in terms of, I'd have to go back. It was a conversation I know that happened about certain titles that came up. It was something that I think was a conversation. I don't know if Mrs. Overholzer was the librarian at the time or not. It came up in conversation with librarians to look at the titles that they had just to make sure that there was nothing that should be questionable. Would it be permissible to ask Melissa to speak to that? No, okay.
Okay.
I appreciate knowing that because it is relevant as to the resources, you know, that were devoted to children's books, that, you know, were devoted to preventing students from reading them or preventing them from having access to them. And, you know, some of the excuses that are being raised tonight as to why we can't protect our kids. All right? But we can protect them from things that other people are offended by, okay? Which have nothing to do with corrupting minors. So now I understand, though, that this, you know, the opt-in and opt-out is impractical impractical either way. What I think we need, and what a lot of people think we need, are some standards. For example, a lot of people, more than, well, I don't know the number, a lot of people saw us talk about passing a policy that said that we are not going to move sexually explicit, age-inappropriate materials into our elementary schools, and we were not able to pass that policy. You know, how dare anyone not vote to approve that policy, that we do not put pornography in elementary school libraries? So, you know, that's the extreme version of this, but it's not extreme. The simple presentation of this is, and now I'll speak to, you know, one of those studies like some of my friends do. I don't like doing it, but just last week, the Mercury published on their front page, a paper that 63% of voters, of people, were in support of banning books from public libraries. And they don't mean banning. They mean restricting inappropriate books for minors. That's what they mean. And that's what we're about. We are parents. And I do not want to force something inappropriate on anybody else's kid, and I do not want it forced on my kid. So I appreciate an opt-out. You know, there might be books that people want to opt out from. People might want to opt out from the Bible. They might not want their child exposed to that. That's fine, and that's polite to all our parents. An opt-in is almost impossible, too. You know, because that is also based on standards and enforcing it by having standards so that we can evaluate books and put them on some sort of opt-in list. Whereas what we need and what we're not doing, and I can't see why we're not doing it because the state has already provided us with a framework to do it, is establish standards to protect minors from harmful materials. So that's all I have for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Yep, thank you. Okay. So I didn't get to share my second point, and you guys will be moving on, and I won't be here and won't be able to comment. So my comment is, I wonder if part of the reason that we're here is because some of the books, one of the books, Fun Home, that was challenged was approved by five teachers, 3 administrators, all said that this graphic novel, which is extremely graphic in parts of it, has value and needs to stay in our schools. So for me, I would appreciate us looking at the state code that's already been defined or looking at PICO. So I'm wondering, Dr. Russell and Mrs. Smith, if we can move it to next month and you will maybe look at hear some of the discussion, make any changes or not make changes. That's your prerogative, and bring it back to the committee next month. Are we in agreement with that? We'll just.
So we can certainly debrief and consider what we might recommend for next week. I'm just sort of looking around at people's faces. I'm sorry. Next month. I'm sorry. Next month. And you don't want to come back next week, Mrs. Lofton? I'm sorry. Next month. But yes, administration will absolutely. Mrs. Smith and I are taking notes. We'll debrief and we'll consider what might make sense based on the feedback from the group tonight, the committee.
Before we moved on, an allegation was made against our administration that they are bringing in books that are pornographic and that they've purposely done this over the past 2 years. I think that's inappropriate and uncalled for, and I would like to apologize to our administrators for that comment.
And on the heels of that, there needs to be a level of trust for professionals that. Is there anybody in this room that does not feel as though we have the very best teachers and administrators in charge of educating our children? Do you have children in the school, sir?
I have a 35-year-old son that attended his junior year here. He graduated from South.
I apologize.
What?
I feel as though if we are able to put trust in our faculty and administration for security and safety, we are also able to give them that same due diligence for actually educating our children.
I hear your comment, Ms. White. Thank you. And let's move on to
Yeah,
school
let's move
police
on, shall we?
officers.
Let's talk about the next.
So,
Will we all get a chance to speak next month?
if you would like to speak, go ahead.
And there was public comment earlier.
Correct. There. Excuse
Ellen sits on the
excuse
policy
me.
committee, so he can
Excuse
speak
me.
really during
Excuse
whatever.
me, please. So at the end of a meeting, if you stay for the end, then there will be a time for public comment then. So right now, we're trying to wrap it up and move it on, but Mr. Clellan, if you would like to speak.
Okay. Just wanted to bring up a couple things based on what everyone's been saying, because I've been listening to you. Mr. Larson, you mentioned the Miller test. I just wanted to bring up some context. I think the Miller test was brought into this because it's a Supreme Court decision that responded to pornography and what is obscene, mainly to respond to the challenges that these texts are pornographic. That was what the challenges to the books in the library were centered on. They felt that because there were 2 pages in Fun Home, it was pornographic. So the Miller test was the most recent Supreme Court decision that gave guidance on what is obscene and what isn't. Not that they helped us very well, but they came up with something. I also want to bring up the PICO test just because I'm a little confused by everything I'm reading, because on one site it says that the Supreme Court ruled in the student's favor on First Amendment grounds, holding that the right to read is implied by the First Amendment, and that the government, in this case the school, can't restrict that. So students get to do voluntary inquiry of whatever they want because they have First Amendment rights too. But then another site did say that the PICO decision was split 4-4, and that the remaining justice didn't make the decision. So maybe we can get more information about that, I guess, as we go. I do like that the rewrite of the policy, it augments the process of selecting books, because I think that's a main concern of everyone, is to augment the process of selecting books. And those selection guidelines are strengthened by the updated Policy 109. The books that are here, I mean, they can be challenged. We have the challenge process, and I do think people could get further by participating in the challenge process in the informal discussion before taking their case to social media or beginning a formal challenge once a team is involved and they look to guidance like the Miller test. Books are different. I think our students deserve to follow their own path to learn about what they want. I think they have a constitutional right to that, and I disagree with the idea of protecting students from books. Books are so different. It's not a real experience. You're reading about something. I don't know that we should be referencing criminal law, that if something is in criminal law, it can't be in a book. So I guess that's all I wanted to mention. I'll talk again next month.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you for the discussion. We're going to move on to 705.1.2, 805.2, and I will turn it over to Dr. Russell.
Thank you, Mrs. Mayers. And this is actually something that Mr. Miller and Mr. Weaver will lead, and I'm certainly happy to tag team with them. We had started last month with a conversation about 805.2, which is a policy that we have currently. We've updated 805.2 to now incorporate not only security, but school police officers. Policy 705.1 and 705.2 take us into greater detail about the operations and the roles and responsibilities of these individuals, as well as how they would be involved in incidents. So they get into some of that detail. So we can review very quickly, briefly, the language in these policies and then address questions or comments. So Mr. Miller, I don't know if you're comfortable, but we can go over these policies very briefly and then take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Russell. So looking at 805.2 first, is that all right?
Yes, and it's very straightforward in that it's simply been updated to include school police officers.
So the highlighted portions of that particular section, first comes under the delegation of responsibility. Superintendent shall appoint a school administrator to serve as a school safety and security coordinator. Here, that is my role as a safety supervisor. That was approved 2 years ago, I believe, by the board. This is simply a transition to that role here within the policy itself. As we continue through the delegation of responsibility, section 1, to oversee all, and then we include school police officers and school security guards. The remainder of that section is without change. Now, when we get down to the guidelines at the bottom of the next page, page 3, that's where the section on school police is added, with a number of appropriate citations, which we've blended in from several other districts. Of course, that'll be checked as we go along. So, under the guidelines, school police officers, the district shall employ one or more school police officers and apply to the appropriate court for the appointment and powers of authority in accordance with the provisions of law. School police, a law enforcement officer employed by the district whose responsibilities, including work hours, are established by the district, or independent contractor or individual provided through a third-party vendor who has been appointed in accordance with law and who meets the requirements of contracted services personnel in accordance with board policy. Of course, our intent is to stick with number 1 with our own personnel. Background checks, this applies back to state law as well. Prior to receiving an offer of employment, all school police officers shall comply with the requirements for background checks, certifications, and employment history reviews for all school employees in accordance with applicable law, board policy, and administrative regulations. These requirements are addressed separately in Board Policy 304 for school police employed by the district and Board Policy 818 for school police employed by an independent contractor or third-party vendor. District shall conduct a law enforcement agency background investigation in compliance with applicable law and regulations for all school police employed by the district and shall review a background investigation conducted for all school police employed by an independent contractor or third-party vendor. Following the officer of employment, the district shall request a separation record for a school police officer employed or contracted by the district in accordance with applicable law and regulations for law enforcement agencies. Requirements: the district shall annually report the following information regarding school police officers receiving required training to the Pennsylvania Department of Education and the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency. District's name and number of school police officers employed or contracted by the district, the municipalities comprising the district, the type of training provided to each school police officer. The district shall make reports regarding hiring and separation and shall maintain all records as required by a law enforcement agency in accordance with applicable law and regulations. School police shall take and subscribe to the oath of office required by law, and the district shall request that the court grant the school police officer authority to carry a firearm in accordance with the law. The school police officer shall maintain all applicable firearm license and training requirements in accordance with the law and board policy. School police officers shall successfully complete required training in accordance with the law and other required staff training, including district training on the use of positive behavior supports, de-escalation techniques, appropriate responses for behavior for students with disabilities, in accordance with law, regulations, and board policy.
Mr. Miller, if I could, maybe I can interrupt if that's all right. I just wanted to emphasize that this particular paragraph is an important one because during our meeting last month, this was something that was raised as a question or a concern. How will school police officers in the district be professionally developed? And this paragraph intends to call out some of the details of the Professional Development Act 55, which is a requirement on the part of all staff in our district. All staff, professional, paraprofessional, custodial, maintenance, must participate in some number of hours of training connected to these topics as well. So the effort here is to really articulate that very clearly. I wonder if there are questions about some of what Mr. Miller has shared regarding the pieces here in this policy now that have been added based on school police officers and the language that goes with them, as opposed to just security.
Correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like we're leaving language in now to allow for SROs, even though we don't intend on doing that?
We don't intend on doing that. That's part of a cut and paste over that has been in sample policies from other districts. And we can certainly.
Is it something
include
that we want to, do we want to leave it in there so that we leave that possibility open? Or is the committee feel that this is something that maybe we do want to cut? Because I know that at least in previous conversations about bringing in school police, it seems like the community and several of the leaders were of the opinion that we didn't want to go down the SRO road, and leaving it within policy as a possibility makes it a lot easier to go down that road. I think the community may feel a lot more comfortable if we were to remove that from the policy. Not saying that we can't go down that road at some point.
Right.
Mr. Liggett, can you tell us exactly where you're seeing that, please?
Exactly where I'm seeing.
Yes.
When Mr. Miller was
SROs.
reading, when Mr. Miller was reading, he did mention that.
You know where it is? We're
I don't
looking
know
for it.
specifically right now. I don't have it in front of me. But as I was listening, he did mention SROs, and that's why I questioned him first to make sure that my question was valid. It wasn't. I'm not just trying to go off of nowhere.
Bob,
Opinion on what you were asking, that's why I wanted to know also where it is, to understand the context of where he had it in there.
Yeah, I don't.
Okay.
You raise a good point.
And go ahead, Mrs. Lofton.
so I think where that came up was right at the very beginning, and actually I had a question about this, under school police officers, and there's one or two, and I see that there's only a blue plus mark next to one, and it was my understanding that two would open the door for SRO, so I didn't know if that meant, because there's not a blue check mark for two, that we're not incorporating that, but that's an option if we wanted to use it. So, down below there are, just as we're looking at this, there are some places where we see these blue check marks or blue plus signs, which I take to mean that we are incorporating that. But if there's not a blue plus sign next to that too, are we not incorporating that paragraph? Because I think that's the SRO paragraph.
So it was on page 1, right?
Page 3, guidelines.
Yeah.
That's the first one.
So I think the intent on the part of administration at this point was to incorporate language that covers school security and school police officers and not necessarily school resource officers. I feel like we're still doing our research and exploring, although we've certainly heard some comments that are influencing our thinking from individuals on the board or the public. However, I wanted us to conduct our due diligence and explore some things that have been brought to our attention. The intent here was to really only reference school security and school police officers, not school resource officers.
Right.
So is it the intent as this is being presented that paragraph number 2 there is or is not being recommended. Because, again, not having the plus sign next to it, I'm not sure
Right.
what that means.
If,
the specific paragraph?
yeah, I'm going to do that in the draft.
Police officer, is that the one that you're
Right.
referencing, number 2?
Bottom of number, almost the bottom of page 3.
Because Mrs. Lofton and Mr. Liggett, if we're defining school security personnel, I don't have a problem with having SRO as part of a definition, but if we're gonna have SRO as part of how we're maybe going to stand this up, then I think maybe we should strike that. Because I don't think we're talking about school resource officers, we're talking
No,
about
we're not right
SROs.
now, no.
Well, that was my point, is that the conversations previously
Right
has
here.
been to exclude school resource officers, mostly because the only place that we can draw from really is Lower Frederick. The rest of the district is without that.
And there were other aspects and other context about, pros and cons between SPOs and SROs, and so if we don't have all that built into here, then why are we putting SROs into here?
And I 100% agree with you on that. That's why I think any references to SROs at this point, and in my thinking, we should be removing that. If we ever go down that road again, then we can reinsert in as policy. But I think from a standpoint of clarity, if our policy does not have SROs, then the community can take comfort that any police officers that we have are going to be our employees hired with our standards, and I mean nothing against people that could be an SRO, but somebody that we have full control over. And face it, the Lower Frederick and the remote possibility of Collegeville was really just a very recent development, and I don't think any of us are prepared for that. So, like I said, I'd like to see SROs struck from the policies.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Weaver has.
So if I could, maybe I could provide some clarification. Remember, this is an existing policy, 805.2. That definition currently exists, and that's cited as a number 1. And if you look at the citation in the back, that comes directly from the code that we're drawing a lot of this information from, 24 PS 1301-C, which is we are taking that definition right from the criminal code law, right from the code, and putting it in there, and it currently exists. So the definition in and of itself has mentioned school resource officer as it currently does, and we are not changing the existing policy for those particular items, only in the green area, and our intent is to just add school police officer, which we didn't have in the current policy. So,
I'm okay with it in the definition part.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the only place we're using it.
and I also agree with Mrs. Lofton that I believe the blue plus sign means that that's what we would want to incorporate, because we took the PNN that we derived this from, went back and found it with Ms. Widener's help, and then added that in there. So I do agree with Mrs. Lofton. That's what that blue plus sign means.
So do we want to strike that number 2 from school police? Okay, you did that, okay. Oh, that's right. Yours is the only one that changes.
Mrs. Mears, before we continue, I have a foundational question that I wanted to ask, because in Dr. Russell's superintendent's report that she sent out, I believe it was last week, she mentioned that there's going to be also an implementation of a safety and security ad hoc committee that is going to help guide the creation and implementation of the police force. And I'm just curious if you can talk a little bit more about, is that going to be like an ongoing community oversight committee? Is that something that gets worked into here? Like, what is the purpose and goal of that, and how might that wind up interfacing with how we're discussing policy?
So I think right now, the vision for me, the purpose of me suggesting that we convene that ad hoc was in response to some around the board expressing that we hadn't had enough conversation. And there are some experts that have served on the Safety and Operations Committee over the years. So the idea was to get some feedback from them, more so around administrative regulations, which help us to know how to uphold policy and the daily comings and goings of roles and responsibilities. Whether or not we would go to some sort of community, forgive me, I don't remember the phrase you just chose to use.
I've heard the idea thrown about that there could be some sort of oversight group that would include members of the community, and to ensure that, just to have some community oversight of everything that's going on.
And that input and that feedback and that particular ad hoc committee could be a group that provides that sort of feedback and that input. Last month, we also talked about administering a sort of baseline survey or assessment, and then following that up sometime later, whether it was halfway through a year or after a full year of working with school police officers, to again gauge that community response to having these individuals as part of our team. So I think we're trying to figure out from the policy language all that must be considered. We continue to fine-tune and delineate, and how will the experts on this ad hoc help us, based on their experiences, their knowledge, to really continue to fine-tune the admin regs.
So that's going to be more focused on the admin regs, and they're going to be guided based on what discussions we have here?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
And and I think that's an important clarification, because the policies, these policies, 805.2 came from PSBA, 705.1 and .2 came from other districts around us. So we looked to them and considered the language. The administrative regs are where we can get into some more detail and be very clear with individuals that work for us, with us, or are a part of our community, what the expectations are and how they'll be carried out.
Wasn't there also, I think Springford has a group, is it just a student group that meets with the police, where they just give input into how they are, am I incorrect? I heard or read that somewhere, saw that somewhere.
I'm not sure about that. It's possible. I'm not sure.
Okay, because I was wondering if that's what you've heard. I know I saw that somewhere now. I'm not sure where I saw it. But I think there's a student not advisory, but just an interactive group that meets with the police force once a month or once every couple months, just to gauge, just to get a temperature on how things are going.
Okay.
Is there wording in any of these, or have you started to put together language around what that sort of either community or oversight committee would look like, how they're going to operate, or the surveying mechanism and how we're going to do that? Like you mentioned, maybe twice a year. You said community. I assume it would be parents and students as well, and that feeds back into this operating committee, so that we look and see what's good and we keep replicating, but when we see something that's challenging or not good, we maybe reassess. And I think, I remember suggesting that I think that has to be part and parcel of this going forward. We have to have a baseline and then a survey mechanism. But have we started the language in there? Because I didn't see it in any of these docs yet.
No, we haven't started the language around that, and I think we have plans to discuss that with this ad hoc group and get some of their feedback and actually experiences around that sort of approach, because it's appealing to me to continue in an ongoing manner to get the pulse from our community as we add these resources to our team. So do they have suggestions? Does Springford have a model? We've sort of been looking to some schools around us for some models that we can at least work from. And I think this committee will also provide some information. We need to clearly articulate what that community feedback would look like, how frequent it will occur, and in what format. Yes, who will be a part of it or be invited to be a part of it.
Any other comments about 805.2? Okay, Dr. Russell?
Yeah, so I'll jump to 705.1 and 705.2, which are under property, the section property, whereas 805.2 is under operations. That's a policy that falls in a different category. And here, we get into more details about the responsibilities of school police officers as part of our safety and security team, and what the board authorizes these police officers to be able to do once they are in turn authorized by a court and have the appropriate qualifications to serve in this capacity. And so this policy, 705.1, gets into some of the details of what they may be involved in on a daily basis. And you can see those in the list here. Now, there are, I see the mention of force here. We've talked about a couple of other policies that exist in the 800s in some other districts. 830, which we have and serves a different purpose, and 834. 830 right now in one district is reporting on the use of force. 834 is the use of force. So there is opportunity to get into greater detail about that aspect. And I'm aware that that's a concern, and that has raised some questions about how we will operate as school police officers. We don't have those policies ready for tonight, but they do exist in some other districts.
If I can follow on to that, that's one of the greatest areas of concern that I've heard as well. And when in looking here under guidelines, it says that there's going to be the development of force guidelines and procedures. I would hope that we would maybe have that at the policy level of where that is integrated. And one of the questions that came to my mind too as I was thinking about this, if I recall, we have policies on when restraints can be used, and I don't know if the police are required to follow the same restraint policies that apply for other district staff, or if that's so. Again, everything that I've heard around the concerns about this is when and where are the police officers going to be engaging in managing, they should not be managing student behavior. So at what point where is that threshold where they engage in a police officer capacity? And I think that's really
and
the
employ the
question mark
use
for
of
everyone.
employ
Yeah.
the use of force.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mr. Miller, can you speak to that? Okay, thank you.
Ms. Lofton, so part of that goes back to our MOU that currently exists with all our law enforcement agencies. The school district police department would mirror that in many ways. However, handling of discipline matters would continue to be routed towards our administration, much like they are today by anyone who may be observing some kind of behavior that's not appropriate. So whether it's our school security staff, school police officers, teachers, whoever that might be, we're going to be very specific about what that differentiation is. And the MOU already establishes that with our partners, the State Police, Collegeville, and North Frederick, and we can apply that as well to anyone we employ within the district. Just so happens our MOU is up for renewal. So the part of the conversations that we're having is how do we blend that, if you will, so that we adopt those same policies within our policies in the district as well as outside the district. So if we have a significant event, do we revert back to going outside or do we keep it inside? If we have a minor event, we don't want that to become a law enforcement event. So we're not looking to use law enforcement in the school to do the job of discipline that administrators are used to doing. And we need to be very specific about that. The only reason I really want you to understand the differentiation here with the MOU is that that's driven by the state. There are required pieces of investigations that we must report to the state, and then there are discretionary ones, so lesser crimes, if you will. But even as we operate currently, if we were to call the state police or Lower Frederick or Collegeville in to assist us with something, it's only after that discipline process typically already starts with our administration. I don't know, Mr. Marsh, if you want to speak to that process or not, but we don't even include our security team currently in that role because the difference between discipline at school and discipline by law enforcement is driven by either reasonable suspicion or probable cause. And we don't want to cross that line. We don't want to blur that to, one, jeopardize the future of any of our students by making something a law enforcement issue that clearly is not. And as well, we want to provide the supports that discipline through the school system can provide to them so that we're not pushing them into the system, if you will. And we have to be very deliberate about that. And then following what that MOU guides us to do is the beginning or the foundational piece of that for us. And we can certainly blend more of that into policy and administrative regulations as we move forward. So I hope that answers your question.
That does. I do have two follow-up questions. So the first is about the MOUs. Are those documents that will ultimately be shared publicly, or is I assume the negotiations confidential, or
No,
No,
they're
is
public
that-
documents.
they are public
You can
documents?
search. We currently use the state standard. A number of years back, the Montgomery County District Attorney would overlook these MOUs countywide to just provide some guidance. They have since reversed their stance on it and said, let's use the state guideline and stick with it. So we had always used the state guideline here because the state police are our primary agency and they're bound by the state MOU. So even if we presented to them something from the Montgomery County DA, they would revert back and say, we're only going to sign this. So we thought it was better at the time, and now I think we're in the third cycle where we're using the state format.
Okay.
So that document's available if anyone wants to search it. It's online. For the state police have them posted. There's a number of agencies that have it. PCCD has it up. The Pennsylvania.
if someone wants to find it, they
Department
can
of
go
Ed.
find it.
It's out
and
there. Yep.
Find that information. And then, I support everything that you just shared. I just going back to number 3 on this list, that we're going to have use of force guidelines and procedures. I'm wondering if maybe somehow this gets changed, that we're going to wind up having a policy around the use of force as opposed to a guideline. It sounds like that's something that's in development.
Well, so there are policies that exist that we're looking at all the policies connected to school police officers. 830 in some districts is reporting on the use of force. 834 is the use of force. So Mr. Weaver, Mr. Miller, and I are looking at 834, use
Okay.
of force. And then whatever appropriate administrative regs would need to come along with that would be ones that we would want to develop as well.
So that's going to be an ongoing
Yeah.
discussion. Okay.
Yeah, and tonight this evening we wanted to bring to the committee these 3, what I would refer to as basic core policies, introducing school police officers into the setting, and then we'll continue to add and consider whatever other policy language is appropriate, as well as those admin regs.
So, Mr. Miller, am I correct in hearing you then? So, for example, a crisis intervention team, that the SPOs wouldn't be involved unless it reached a level where you would typically have to call the police if we didn't currently have SPOs in our school?
Correct.
Okay,
So the
thank you.
training piece of that is just the recognition factor. Like, okay, I have a CPI issue, I need to call the CPI team. Or I have a threat assessment issue, let me call the threat assessment team.
So then, to that point, and to your point too, Mrs. Lawton, then is it correct in saying that we will then be very intentional, about how we, develop those engagement guidelines, right? We're going to codify all that and have it very transparent to the community
Absolutely.
and the board, right? So that, to your points, I think it's Determining when the police are involved at the school would be essentially the same as if we had decided administration had to call the police.
Correct.
And that's when they're involved, right?
Correct.
And so we shouldn't see a higher incidence really of police involvement than we would have otherwise.
Hopefully not.
We don't want to keep them, bored. Hopefully they'll have a lot to work on, but
Right.
I just want to make sure that that will be part of our regulations or guidelines that are developed.
Absolutely. And we've discussed examples with other districts currently, so.
Mrs. Mayor, if I could add to the conversation. Mr. Mill and I have spent a lot of time, and I've learned a lot of new and interesting parts and components. But the one thing that Mr. Miller continuously turns to is the force continuum and how different it looks in his life as a career police officer versus what this will look like for our officers in this building. And that is a lot of the information and the background stuff that you guys are asking about, that we are already engaged in and looking at different types of policies and procedures that some school districts have. It is interesting, we are looking at Springford and Souderton, and their approach to their policies couldn't be more different. So Springford has reporting of force and use of force in their policies. Souderton does not have that. So they figured that they've already addressed it in their 705.1 and an 805.2, and that's it. So we are trying to work along the guidelines like Springford to get a lot of it in the framework of the policy and then work on those ARs behind the scene to help drive a lot of that.
Do you have any other questions for 705.1? Discussion, so 705.2.
Maybe I can get us started, and then I'm sure there will be questions, or I anticipate questions for Mr. Miller. But this policy talks about school police incidents, and it's more specific to what school police would be doing and how they would do it, where the limits are in some cases, whether it's interviewing students, arresting students, searching students, reporting incidents, if there are using their vehicles, and they mention vehicle stops, coming upon an intoxicated individual and what that looks like, medical treatment of individuals. So this gets into some of the more specifics, and then there is one administrative regulation that we did include, which is some extra duty or moonlighting, as they call it, for individuals who serve in these roles. They can work for some other organizations outside of their work hours here in Perkiomen Valley. So this one's a little bit more specific than some of the two previous policies in terms of what their day might incorporate or include.
Any questions?
I was hoping somebody would go first. In the first section of it where we talk about interviewing students, so we talk about that school police officers who wish to interview students on property will notify the building principal or designee. There's some other language in there related to interviewing school employees or school officials, et cetera. So what's absent in this area that I'm seeing, and maybe it's just not built out yet, is that students, constitutional and or other rights are not being waived in any guidelines or policies that we write up here, right? So in interviewing students, are we going to have language that says that we have to still comply with all rights of those students? So for example, the student knows that they don't need to speak if they're being interviewed, that they could have their parents come, that they're told that they can have their parents come, or a lawyer, et cetera. So I want to make sure that the language doesn't open it up that makes it seem like the police can just interview students ad hocly after they just inform the school principal. Is that going to be addressed, or am I?
I just want to jump on that question too, because I should say ask it in a different way. Currently, so currently, If we have a situation that requires us to call the barracks and ask for a trooper to come over, that is the phone call that is made home to families. Is basically not basically there's three options here. We can wait till you get here. You can give me verbal permission to sit in and act in loco parentis, or you can say nobody's talking to my student right now, and they may choose to. Now, in my experience, most families choose the first option: wait for me to come in, and I'll speak to them. And that was my question to Dean: is this different now? Because of this in that role, because that's what I would have anticipated reading there too, just from my experience.
That's
So,
right, that's what
yeah.
I would have expected, and since I didn't see it, that's why I'm asking the question. And maybe it's just not, written out yet.
No, there are pieces of this that need to be blended in. This is almost part and parcel from the MOU I spoke to. If you go down, there's a list of notifications to police. That piece comes right out of that as well. So, excuse me.
So I think what I'd like to do is take that feedback and incorporate some new updated language into the policy based on what you've shared.
Do we need to also delineate what is an appropriate area, or that's just training that you'll do? I mean, we'll have places in the building, I would assume, where there's some privacy and the ability to interact as needed. Sorry.
So the quick answer is yes, because I don't know how long till I cough again.
Yeah, well, can you live here?
I'm good. It's full. He's trying to take care of me. I appreciate that. We've already talked about reconfiguring some spaces within buildings to do just that. I mean, quite frankly, I don't anticipate a whole lot of interaction with elementary students on this level. Middle and high school, probably a little bit more, but all of our buildings have space available. We just have to decide how we're going to incorporate that.
Any other comments? Okay. All right. Well, thank you. And so then, Dr. Russell, this will just move forward to next month, and then you'll take into consideration the ad hoc committees that we're meeting, and you'll bring forth some, maybe it sounds like possibly an addition or some more robust language. And anything else?
No, I think that covers it. We will take all the feedback that was provided tonight, incorporate it, and then bring it back for committee review next month, yes. And we'll probably also work on the use of force policy 834.
Okay, thank you. Closing items, any comments from the audience?
Hi, my name is Dwita. Oh my god. Hi, my name is Dwita. I'm a freshman at the high school. Okay, the first thing I want to start with is Miss Folk and Miss White. Thank you for giving credit to our teachers, because I think they deserve way more credit than we give them. Mr. Cleland, to your point, sorry, I'm a little bit nervous. Books are culture. They're experiences of individuals. And Mr. Keenan, to your point, All Boys Aren't Blue is actually a acclaimed young adult novel for students 13 and above. Students are, we have rights. Most of us at the high school are actually taxpayers too. We're people that are going out into the world and eventually going to college and having similar experiences, if not already. So these books provide us with an ability to connect, with the world around us. If we don't have that opportunity, we're subjecting our students to pretty much a way of telling them, this is the one experience that you're allowed to see in the world. That isn't how the world works. And honestly, we've all experienced the pandemic at this point. I was in 6th grade. We've seen So much happened these past few years, and honestly, it's a little bit disappointing that we're having this conversation. Excuse me. I just wanted to say that as a student and from a student's perspective, that there's so much other, things that we could be investing our time into. This shouldn't be a conversation that's even occurring. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name's Bradley Server, 10-year plus resident of the district. Had a son in high school here for 1 year. First off, I'd like to thank him, and I have one real quick comment for the lady here. For you to suggest that I have no voice because I don't have any children in this school at this time is absurd. Thank you.
Any other comments? Oh, sorry.
My name's Jim Main from Lower Frederick Township. I just read an article online, posted yesterday from Lancaster Online. It says that the state police had about 10,000 applicants a year in the 1990s. In 2022, that was last year, that number dwindled to only 1,000 applicants. The reason I'm bringing this up is because I want to know if the board has considered yet, when we open up the application process, I did notice that let me see here. I'm sorry here. It says the school and safety coordinator shall within 1 year of appointment complete required training. It doesn't state in our guidelines yet for school police officers whether you're going to require to have them all the training, meaning there are existing police officers that you're going to hire, or if you're going to possibly send existing security officers or open up the applications to possibly high school students that graduate that might want to enter criminal justice and that want to have long-term commitment to the school district, stay either employed in the school district or live in the school district and raise a family in the school district. I don't want to see senior police officers be poached from neighboring departments thinking they can start their retiring, land a cushy job, and don't have a long-term intention to stay in the school district and maybe say live out the last 2 or 3 years of their career, get a school pension, and then retire, and you're going to have a high turnover of officers possibly, especially since it's going to be the initial forming of the police department. You're obviously going to want to have a very senior person, hopefully motivated, passionate, to be the chief of the school district police department, because they're going to have to show some great leadership skills to the officers, help them fulfill their duties and to the student population. So I just want to make sure you guys understand whether or not, if you have made a decision yet or not, if you're going to, because when I looked up the Act 120 training for school municipal police officer for Montgomery County, the next opening for training is until January of 2024 for municipal police officer training for Montgomery County.
Thank you.
Mike Sheridan, Skippack resident. I just wanted to compliment the board member who questioned the use of the Miller test. If you start using a First Amendment obscenity test as your standard, you have a guarantee that you're going to have a policy that accomplishes nothing. I think a much better direction, although I haven't read them, was the Mr. Keenan's reference to existing state law and regulations under it. That might be a very good starting point, because you've had legislative committees who've studied it, they've worked on it, or they've reworked it, and then they've adopted it. So I think that might be a better direction. On the opt-in, opt-out, I think opting in is a better approach. I think it's an approach that will address the needs or potential needs of a minority of the students while respecting the view of the majority of the parents. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let's let everybody else speak first. Thank you.
Wade Weston, Collegeville Borough. First off, I'd like to commend the young lady here for standing up and speaking her mind this evening. As a freshman in high school, I would never have been able to do that as a freshman in high school. I am 63 years old and I am still petrified generally to speak in front of a group, but sometimes you have to get up and say something. With regard to the school police policies, I provided some comments by email to this group. I hope that they will be addressed at some point. With regard to the policies around the library books, I still cannot believe that we have spent this much time on the discussion of these policies. A huge amount of the community's time and resources have been invested in this discussion and is just, in my opinion, not necessary. It's a little ridiculous if you ask me. The discussion started with claims that there were obscene and pornographic materials in the school libraries. That's a ridiculous accusation on the face of it. But now we seem to be backpedaling about it and saying, well, it's not porn, it's not obscene materials necessarily, but we want to make sure that age-appropriate materials are in the library. Well, there are already people here that you employ, that you pay a salary to make those determinations. We have a library staff, we have a curriculum staff whose job it is to make that age-appropriate assessment. And why can't we just let our people who we pay to do this make these assessments? Why don't we trust our librarians? Why don't we trust our academic staff? If they're saying that these are age-appropriate materials, that's what they're trained to do. That's the judgment that they are here to make. And then we always seem to come back to things like, well, what about Fun Home? What about All Boys Aren't Blue? How can those possibly not be considered obscene? Well, I don't think All Boys Are Blue has been assessed. I don't think there's been any challenge that I'm aware of, but Fun Home was challenged. Fun Home was determined to keep in the library. You have access to the review materials. You have the opportunity to talk to the people that reviewed that book. If you want to know what they found the value in, read the reviews, talk to them. Better yet, read these books yourselves. I have. I don't find, and you say about keeping materials out that appeal to a prurient interest that could get somebody hot and bothered. Certainly nothing in either of those books got me hot and bothered. And I think if they got you hot and bothered, it says a lot more about you than about the materials. So please, get off of this topic. We have a lot more important things to discuss. Let our staff, whose job it is to make these assessments, make these assessments. Please.
I think one whole thing was missed in the discussion about the books and which ones are appropriate. I would totally object to any teacher reading a book to my child that suggests them to be a transgender, for them to suggest that they were born in the wrong body. I would totally object to that. Thank you.
Hello, Michelle Seibel. I'm from Perkiomen Township. So I think it's important to comment tonight that I want the educators in our district to know that we do not all subscribe to the beliefs that were shared by a small handful of people in this community and on this committee this evening. To the educators and administrators in our district, you are world class, you are appreciated, you are amazing, and you are the reason for many of the successes of the amazing students here at PV. And again, I want to commend the student that got up here tonight. I have two students. I have a senior and a sixth grader. Both are excellent students whose love of learning was fostered right here by our very own Perkiomen Valley educators. Their teachers have spent hours bringing difficult subjects to life, both during and outside of school hours. They have been another set of eyes within these school buildings and offered valuable insights on both of their journeys. I'll share the experience of my older son, Christian, since he will graduate from Perkiomen Valley, where he attended 10 of his 12 years. It was within these libraries where he discovered his love of learning. It was within this library and those of middle and elementary schools where he checked out probably no less than 300 books. And it was those librarians who, at my request, would provide me a list of those books so that I would know which not to purchase. It was within these buildings he found a love and passion for language and the opportunity to become bilingual. As he's applied to colleges over the last year, he was offered admission to some of the nation's most prestigious colleges. And with almost all, if not every admission, was offered nothing less than 75% merit-based scholarships. This fall, he'll take his 12 advanced placement classes and 2 dual enrollment classes to a university where he was awarded a full tuition scholarship. Dr. Clune, I think we have the newest RAM in this room. It may sound like a mom bragging about her child, and of course I'm very proud, but it's a parent grateful to the world-class educators in this district that accompanied my son along his journey. I'm here to brag about every teacher that accompanied him. They all had a part in getting him where he is and where he will go. As we continue to attempt to influence policies that take away from the curriculum rather than add to it, there will be less opportunities like the one my son has had. As we become less competitive, we'll have fewer successes that our students can celebrate. We're going down a path where our students will not be able to compete with their peers across the country, let alone across the globe. Why are we trying to diminish the quality of our curriculum, especially when our students are entering one of the most competitive markets, whether business or academia, that we've ever known? To the community, please think about our students and their futures when you vote in May.
Anyone else? Okay. All right. The policy committee minutes will be attached following the meeting, and the meeting dates are on there. And that ends the meeting. Thank you.